Thank you so much for being here. My name is Chelsea Silva. I'm with River Network, and I'm pleased to be here with you along with Colorado Water Conservation Board to present this Wildfire Ready Action Planning virtual workshop. For today's call, please use the chat box for questions. As you can see, we have over 100 participants, and so that will just make it a little easier for us to manage your questions and make sure we answer them in order. If you are having trouble with that, you can throw a message in the chat and say you'd rather come off mic, and we can certainly accommodate as needed. Um, uh, the second thing I wanted to mention here is that after this webinar, we really appreciate your feedback. We have a 1-minute survey. We'd love for you to fill that out so that we can hear from you and improve for next time. River Network likes to begin any of our meetings and workshops with group agreements. This is just a handful of the agreements that we have, but I felt these were most applicable for today. The first is respect our diversity, and this is focusing on the fact that we come from different life journeys and we all have different experiences. So, as you're participating today, I think one of the most important things you can think about when it comes to diversity is the use of acronyms. So, before you use an acronym or before you jump to assume that people know what it is, please spell it out, say it, so that we're all on the same page. And I will make sure to do that too. The second is to be present, be open, be authentic. I know it can be easy for you to join one of these calls and say, you know what, I'm just going to shoot off a few emails as we're doing this call. But you came here to be here, and we're excited for you to learn with us. And we hope that you can hold off on those emails and join us right now. The third is to take space, make space. This is a little bit less applicable, but I like to bring it up. If you're somebody who loves to ask lots of questions, just we welcome those questions, but also try to make space for other people who may only fire off one or two questions. We want to make sure that we hear from as many of you as we can, and it'll just make it that much easier if you can recognize how many questions you've been able to have answered versus other folks. Uh, Finally, listen to understand and respond with curiosity. People may be coming to this workshop from with different ideas, and so we encourage you and challenge you to think about what people are bringing to the table and respond with curiosity rather than responding in another way. It'll just make it a space for you to learn. For those of you who don't know, River Network is a national nonprofit. We work to grow and strengthen a transformational network of water justice and river advocates. You can learn more about us on our website. And if you're not familiar with us, we have many free tools and resources for you to use. So please check those out. And we also do a river rally every couple years. And next year, we're doing one in San Antonio from May 11th through the 14th. So check that out. We'd love for you to be there to share your work related to water. Along those lines, within Colorado, River Network hosts our watershed planning peer learning network. And this is a space for you to connect with peers if you're leading watershed planning or you're thinking about leading some sort of watershed planning effort. We offer you workshops like this. We also have in-person events. So if you're in Colorado, we would love to have you there to join us in this peer learning network. As part of the peer learning network, right now we're hosting a flows training series, which is a space for peer-to-peer learning on flow-related topics in Colorado. This is a series of 4 different calls, and the next one coming up will help you learn how to develop flow goals and objectives. That's happening on Tuesday, May 13th, and you can learn more about that at this link, which, by the way, all of these slides for today will be available after the call. So don't worry about jotting this all down. We will send it out. Okay, with that, let me share the outcomes for today's workshop. So, first and foremost, we're here to understand the basics of the Wildfire Ready action plans and the purpose of Colorado's Wildfire Ready Watersheds program. We're also here to engage with peers and learn about their processes, the lessons learned they've had, and the recommendations they've had from their WRAP planning processes, Wildfire Ready Action Planning. We're also here to build a community of practice among WRAP leaders, develop relationships, collectively enhance our WRAP planning throughout the state. And finally, we're here to feel more confident and better equipped to advance RAPs in our local communities. So we're hoping you're here and that these outcomes match why you were interested in this workshop. One caveat I just wanted to share is that if you are joining us from outside of Colorado, you'll notice that most of the dialogue is really going to be geared toward a Colorado audience. And I what I would say is if you're curious about how your work in outside of Colorado relates to this work in Colorado and you want to talk to Chris Sturm with the Colorado Water Conservation Board about these types of plans and how they might relate or not with what you're doing in your state, that might be a separate conversation. I strongly encourage you to reach out afterwards. But for today, we'll focus on building up this community in Colorado. All right, so for today, we are going to kick it off with Jeff Sickles. He will be presenting on the Wildfire Ready Watersheds program. We'll have a Q&A session after that, along not only with Jeff, but with, let me get this, the rest of the technical assistance team, including Michael Blazewitz, Andrea Harbin-Monahan, Katie Yacht, Stephen Reeves, and Chris Sturm. We'll then move into some more presentations focused on these case studies, and we'll first hear from Annie Berleman on transitioning from planning to implementation and project monitoring. Then we'll hear from Angie Davlin on bridging the divide between watershed and wildfire planning. Next, we'll hear from Julie Dubin on doing a WRAP while you have a wildfire going. And we'll close out with Andy Rozzi on how his team did an efficient and effective WRAP. They'll also have space for Q&A, and then we'll wrap up. So with that, whoops, 1 second. I am going to stop sharing, and I'm going to pass it over to Jeff.
Thank you, Chelsea. Share. All right. Does that look okay?
Right.
As well ask before I dive in. Good morning, everybody. I'm Jeff Sickles. I'm with Olson. I'm the lead for the technical assistance team for CWCB. And just wanted to thank Chelsea and River Network for putting together this workshop today and organizing everything. And I wanted to thank all of the speakers that are going to come up afterwards as well for really being willing to share their lessons learned on the wildfire ready action plans that they're developing. So I'm here today to kind of do a very brief refresh on what we're trying to achieve with wildfire ready watersheds and wildfire ready action plans and give you guys some program updates. Probably a lot of you know about these things, but several of you may not know. We've been continually trying to improve the program and improve guidance and provide direction to everybody so that we can achieve even better outcomes on these projects. So some of the discussion topics real quick that I'm going to go through today, a little bit of a program refresh, very short, kind of what's Wildfire Ready all about and why are we here? Some program level guidance updates, some lessons learned on hazard analysis and what we've been doing there as far as providing guidance to all of you. Thinking about susceptibility, I think a lot of RAPs are getting to the point where they're starting to do susceptibility analysis and talking about things that we're recommending and ideas and really kind of seeking even input from all of you and some tools that we're developing to help you out. And then pre and post fire actions and some new guidance there as you're kind of getting into the planning side of things. So just regarding the program, why we're here, why we're doing what we're doing. You know, we started Wildfire Ready to move from being um, reactive to being proactive. And the biggest factor in all of that, when we kind of started to do fire recovery, at least from my expertise back in 2018 and through 2020, was that when you're doing reactive disaster recovery, you're really looking at point of impact type projects that honestly can disrupt stream systems and stream function and disrupt watershed function. And it's not the best way to be doing mitigation. And so working with CWCB and having a lot of conversations, talking to the NRCS, we really thought about this idea of could we get ahead of fires before fires occurred to look at all the post-fire hazards and look at ways that we could mitigate those hazards throughout the watershed at a watershed scale. So thinking about forest health and forest management and reducing burn severity, and then looking at corridor stream projects where we could do things upstream of values at risk and implement that mitigation because those are the types of projects that once the disaster occurs, there's no going back. And again, we're into that kind of mode of reacting. So from a wildfire ready perspective, we look at the values at risk and hazards that are shown here. This is kind of the overall guidance of the program, but you guys have opportunities as sponsors to make it to take those values at risk even further. These are kind of the fundamental values that we look at, and these are the fundamental hazards we look at. So thinking about that flood after fire, erosion zones, water quality, debris flows, and hill slope erosion. But I think what's most important, what I wanted to kind of emphasize today is kind of what the purpose is, what are we trying to achieve with these wraps? And thinking that we need enough hazard analysis to provide detail to understand where we have risk within the watershed. And we need to have hazard modeling done to a level that when we have a fire, those hazard analyses can be updated quickly and provided to disaster recovery teams so that they can kind of update what you've been doing through the wrap. Um, I want to say that, like I think as engineering and planning teams, sometimes we get really into the weeds on we need to be really accurate. I want to just kind of throw out there that, I think from a wildfire ready action plan perspective, these analyses are meant to be conservative. It's okay to have a starting place where the risk is maybe a little bit overstated. This isn't regulatory modeling, it's really risk modeling, and we want to know and understand that risk throughout the watershed. And the end game is really to understand risk so we can identify those watershed scale projects that can be implemented before a fire to reduce that post-fire risk. And the secondary end game, and we want to make sure is that we have a good playbook after a fire of post-fire actions and kind of where that protection needs to be implemented. So just always thinking about that planning process at the end are the outcomes that really determine the future implementation of projects. At the end of 2022, we had completed the statewide susceptibility analysis. And I just talk about this. This was very high level. It was kind of in the sense of like the presence and probability of post-fire hazards, and then the density and presence of values at risk within a given watershed. But this was a good starting point for us to understand where our watersheds were most at risk from post-fire hazards. And it was meant to be a roadmap, right? We knew that we were doing a really high level analysis at the statewide level, and we wanted to kind of indicate to stakeholders, to watershed coalitions, to government agencies around the state where they had potential risk, and then to encourage them, if they were in these kind of high risk zones, then to do a RAP, to do a wildfire ready action plan. So since 2023, when we really started implementing things and grants started going out, there's been 20 wraps that have been started, a few of which have been completed now. This kind of gives you an overview map of where those wraps are occurring throughout the state. And you can start to see when we kind of go from here and we go there, and it's kind of underlaid on here, but you can start to see that we're starting to cover a lot of that high risk zone, high susceptibility zone throughout the state. So that's kind of where we're at. That's the refresh and the reminder of why we're doing wildfire ready watersheds and why we're doing wildfire ready action plans. So I want to get into some updates, some fact sheet updates, some things that we've been doing to provide you guys with guidance. And as we go through here, I tried to kind of get at things too that might prompt your Q&A at the end. So maybe you've taken a look at some of these new documents and had questions, or maybe there's still things that are out there. So, I think as we go along, please do put your questions out there in the chat and we can follow up. Just last month, we released the capacity building and stakeholder collaboration fact sheet. And the primary purpose of this was really to kind of help sponsors, kind of provide them a little bit of a roadmap for their roles and responsibilities while they're leading a wildfire ready action plan. A few other things that are in here, establishing goals and objectives. I know a lot of these wraps probably already have goals and objectives and have gone through that process, but we wanted to just provide some examples for you as a starting point. Those are kind of reflective of the overall program's goals, and they give you an opportunity to kind of take those, think about them, and then really kind of mold them into what your local stakeholders and you guys as a team really want to do as far as your wraps. Kind of on the more practical side, helping you think about identifying and procuring and managing a technical team for your wildfire ready action plan. Um, a little bit of focus on thinking about data collection for values at risk, because foundationally, that data collection for VARs is probably the most important part of a RAP. Because when we did that statewide analysis, we could only use statewide data sets. So our analysis could only be as good as the statewide data available. And that's why when we do a RAP, it's meant for local data, it's meant for local hazard analyses. So really working with stakeholders as best you can to collect that data is going to make your RAP that much better. And then finally, kind of being a leader in developing the pre and post fire action plans, including thinking about project development and project prioritization. So a little bit of information there for you guys as sponsors to kind of work through. And I would recommend that the technical consultants read through this as well. Um, well, I had a moment too, wanted to talk about the QA process. This has been out there for a while, but something we learned in phase two EWP flood recovery from the 2013 floods was that we just needed a QA process to really touch base with project teams and make sure they didn't get too far off course, make sure the technical analyses and the results were kind of in line with what we were trying to do with the program, and just to be here to make sure that there as much opportunity as can be identified. In this case, maybe thinking about actions or susceptibility or any part of the program where we can provide input and enhance your RAP. That's what we're here for. So please don't look at this as being antagonizing at all. What this is just to provide some critical touch points to all of you. Most of you have probably been through. I apologize there. Most of you have probably been through the project scope and cost development because you've got your grants. The next critical meeting is that project kickoff meeting, and really making sure that the methodologies that you're using for your hazard analyses align with the program. If there's any significant questions about what that needs to look like, that we could probably answer questions. And then discussing that data collection side in case there's any data sets maybe that are available on a broader basis that you hadn't thought about. Probably the most technical meeting is that midpoint check-in. That's where we kind of look at your data gap analysis and your hazard analysis review. So that is kind of a technical review from the TA team, but really just in the sense to make sure that we've kind of landed on the type of analyses for the hazards that are going to really support a good susceptibility analysis, are going to support post-fire evaluations when a fire occurs, and kind of really just making sure that we have all of that covered. So, that's kind of that technical part. The susceptibility overview really is just meant to be us kind of working with you and taking a look at where things could go wrong, and then maybe making some early suggestions on what might go into your planning effort on the pre and post fire actions. And then just wrapping it up with the final wrap presentation. So we tried to keep this as simple as possible, but I want to emphasize too, these are not the only touch points that you can reach out to us. Anytime you guys have questions, please don't think that they're silly questions. Please just reach out. Please ask. I mean, the worst thing is for you to kind of go through it and get to the end, and we're at a midpoint check-in, and we could have asked a question, a couple months earlier, and you got you guys an answer. So please ask. If you're having struggles with something, we probably struggled with it too. So just reach out and we can chat about that. So a few lessons learned on the hazard side and kind of what's resulted in new guidance for us. Um, One of the challenges we have, which you guys have probably experienced as technical teams, is um, the wrap funding is limited. You can't just model everything in detail. So the challenge is where and in how much detail should we model hazards as part of a wrap? And so that opportunity from that lesson learned is to think about how we might look at these large scale wraps and focus in on the areas where hazard analysis makes sense. By the way, I never anticipated these wraps were going to be as big as they were. When I first originally was kind of looking at it, I was thinking like 10 Huck 12s would be like the biggest wrap we ever did. And you guys have blown my mind with coming with 40 to 70 Huck 12 wraps. So that's a little bit beyond where I was thinking from the beginning. But that's where some of these kind of level of details analyses really make sense. And so what we've been starting to do is look at VAR density. And I've seen a few teams kind of start to do this already. And so we love that. You guys all have brilliant ideas, and I would also encourage. I would love. I look forward to seeing everything that you all are coming up with. And as Chelsea said, like this is a community kind of raise the bar type thing, and we want as much good feedback, good ideas as we possibly can get to incorporate those into the program and suggest them to other technical teams. So what you're looking at here is a watershed map of the Dolores, and this is a gridded kind of assessment looking at the density of VARs within that watershed. Um, and kind of where you can take that, you can take it a lot of different ways, but we can start to think about where we want to perform these hazard analyses. So on the hydrology side, we always want to do the entire watershed, but there's some potential here as you look at these watersheds and you look at the density of VARs, with the red being the highest and the greens being the lowest, start thinking about maybe we can reduce the level of detail. We just need the level of detail where we get the design points and the hydrographs and the critical locations so we can understand what's going on post fire. On hydraulic side, in basins and corridors with moderate to high risk, again, those green zones really probably wouldn't be places we would do hydraulics. So that starts to peel back that scope a little bit. On the debris flow, we want to do the entire watershed. I think from everything we've seen, I don't think anybody's had too much trouble with that. It's a relatively straightforward process. FHZ, very similar to hydraulics, again, looking in basins and corridors with high to moderate risk. And on the hill slope erosion, again, thinking about the entire watershed. Um, so just, I'm planning on trying to put together a fact sheet on this to help you all out. Maybe that a lot of you already passed this point, but if not, this is just kind of a suggested process on our side. It's not something that's fixed or that you have to do, but maybe possibly doing this gridded evaluation, which is going to tie in the susceptibility analysis that I'm going to talk about in a minute. But it gives you more specifics on corridors and locations where there's assets at risk. So Whitewater did this really nice job on Roaring Fork, looking at where those VAR densities kind of were throughout the watershed. And now you can really start to kind of see like which river corridors might make sense for doing hydraulic analysis and fluvial hazard zone analyses, and where we don't really need a whole bunch of hydrology detail throughout the watershed. So this can just act as a foundation for you guys as a decision maker. You can do this a lot of different ways. Again, we're just kind of, this is something that we've been working on with the gridded and assessment. If you guys have specific questions about this or the susceptibility analysis I'm going to talk about, please do follow up with me. This is all work that's been developed through CWCB and is available to you guys too. But one of the ways you can look at this is you can look at it by asset count. Real simple. You can weight the assets and values as part of that analysis to account for high value assets like reservoirs that might kind of be out on their own. And so they're just kind of floating out there, but you might want some more detailed hazard analyses when you're looking at the impacts and susceptibility there. And the other thing I would suggest is that you look at offsets from stream corridors. We don't necessarily need to worry too much about all of the assets that are upslope, that are up on the hill. We're really looking at river corridors here. So an offset might really help you to kind of weed those values at risk down, that density analysis. Um, Julie's going to talk a little bit about performing a wrap. and having a disaster wildfire event. But one of the lessons learned on that, kind of thinking through RAPS, was that on the hydrology side, we need enough detail from the hydrology for a RAP to do post-fire hydrology updates so that we can understand the risk at a level that supports detailed actions pre and post-fire. So in this case on Alexander Mountain, a lot of the RAP hydrology had kind of been done at pretty much the HUC 12 level. And again, I want to emphasize that you all are doing brilliant jobs on doing all this work. And we're all learning together, and we didn't have any specific guidance at the start of this program. But what we realized is at the HUC 12 level, I mean, for instance, the Alexander Mountain fire almost completely burned within one HUC 12. Well, if we only had one HUC 12 for data, we essentially had one design point, one outflow point from the entire watershed, and everything within that watershed we didn't really have the detail on. So in the end, we ended up having to do a revised model for Alexander Mountain. So we did about 10 outfall points so that we could understand risk within that watershed, do the hydraulic analysis that you're seeing here on the bottom, and then run that susceptibility evaluation. And so essentially the challenge was we need to create consistent modeling that provides enough detail for determining projects before and after a wildfire. That's really what came out of that. And the opportunity was, as we talked about, a technical assistance team was to develop program-wide guidance for hydrology. So this was released back in August. Hopefully, if you're a technical assistance team, you've seen this, but it's up on the website. Please do take a look at it. It really walks you through the whole process of, and primarily from looking at it from a HEC HMS level. There are other alternatives for doing hydrology that are briefly talked about at the end of this guidance and fact sheet in the table of what could be acceptable. I will say if you're thinking about doing something different in HMS, please talk to us as a technical assistance team and we'll kind of kick that back and forth and see what makes sense. So this is out there. I know this starts to get into the deep level of detail of basins from about, I think, a half square mile to 3 square miles compared to, the size of a HUC 12. And, that gets into a lot of detail and starts to kind of get into this issue of budget. And that's why that kind of pre-hazard kind of bar density analysis might make sense. We're still working through some things on this and invite ideas, but I wanted to make sure that all of you technical assistance teams knew this was out there. All right. Just moving on. Apologies for moving so fast. I had a lot of material to cover. On the susceptibility side, some challenges, recommendations, and future guidance and tools. I do want to again note things that I'm talking about today, they're suggestions. There's nothing right now that's required from a program level. I would love, I know that Katie Yacht is working on some really cool ways of thinking about susceptibility and how that relates to planning. And others of you are probably thinking about different ways of doing this too. This is just what we've come up with. I found it to be relatively simple, and we're going to develop some tools for this that you can use. But please feel free to kind of move forward on your susceptibility analyses the way that you guys think best makes sense. Um, but the lesson learned is susceptibility on a watershed corridor and point of impact scale, which is essentially what's recommended in the template scope of work. It needs that level to provide those insights to planners that we can use to determine where pre and post fire projects can occur and that make the most sense to mitigate those hazards. The challenge is kind of like we're getting some really big watersheds. So how can we show susceptibility in a way that's easy to understand at large scales? So the opportunity in my mind was maybe we can develop a methodology to identify risk that addresses all three of those, watershed, corridor, and point of impact. And kind of we can see it on an easy to view basis. And that's what you're seeing here is just kind of this gridded susceptibility map. Just reminding ourselves quickly what those post-fire impacts are. As we go through all of this, thinking about loss of life and flooding and flood damage, impacts to water resources infrastructure. That was really one of the main focuses of Wildfire Ready and that statewide susceptibility analysis was thinking about post-fire susceptibility for water resources infrastructure. Transportation and utility interruptions that always occur post-fire, and then getting into specifics on how debris flows impact different areas. This is Black Hollow, for those of you who haven't seen that picture before, debris flow after the Cameron Peak fire. Um, Dam failures, probably more on the non-jurisdictional side, water quality, of course, natural resource loss, and impacts to the economy. And I just want to remind everybody that this values at risk is your foundation. So those foundational VARs that we have in there and we talk about in the scope of work, those are the ones we absolutely want to make sure we get included in a wrap. And then you guys as stakeholders and sponsors can kind of work with everybody and think about what's an enhanced level for us. Is it, power and infrastructure, contaminated sites that might be within your watershed, recreation and community assets, and more. So it really comes down to all of you. Just work with your technical teams, work with your stakeholders, and but build that value at risk data set because it moves in when we think about susceptibility, kind of look at two databases that we're kind of essentially building. One being that values at risk geodatabase, which is all of our values throughout the watershed. And then you're having your technical team develop the hazards geodatabase, all those hazards. And then we can intersect those and create a susceptibility geodatabase, which is really a point of impact. Every single asset within the watershed being identified as potentially susceptible to a post-fire hazard. So getting into the nitty-gritty of that, as you're working through it, thinking literally asset by asset on what those impacts are and whether there's opportunities. And this will be in the fact sheet I'm going to develop for the gridded risk identification procedure, the grip. But really kind of thinking about an asset against a hazard and what makes sense for that intersection. Whether in this case, when we think about reservoirs and dams, maybe hydrologic change, debris flow, and sediment delivery are the three that we can run intersections on, whereas flood after fire and fluvial hazard zones may not apply directly. So again, each team can kind of work through these. I've got an example that we did on Middle Colorado for those of you that want, that I could share out and you can kind of take a look at it and kind of get into the weeds of that. But the idea is that we would run kind of this intersection and we do a risk severity. So that kind of gets into the idea. And best example I have is say a house that maybe it's in the 2 year or it's in the 5 year or the 10 year or the 25 year. And so if it's in the 25 year, it's got a lower risk severity than something that would be in a 2 year post fire. So that's that 1 to 10 rating. And then a VAR priority weighting really can be set via the stakeholders early on. And that could be a part of your pre-hazard analysis as well, that weighting. Anyway, you end up with a score of 1 to 100, kind of showing its overall risk. And then you can aggregate that into a grid and kind of create this heat map throughout the watershed. We did this on Alexander Mountain, as you can see here, post-fire. But this provides that visual understanding of where assets are susceptible to post-fire hazards throughout the watershed. It also does an individual values at risk. So you can kind of see that underlying assets diagram down there in the bottom. So we can color code every single asset within the watershed. The grid is just the way to look at it on the big scale because you wouldn't pick up any of these small things at that scale. So that's why this kind of works nicely together. And it's an opportunity to really look at everything and start to think about where we can do upstream projects. And it's important to note that this suggested methodology is not the end all. High risk assets absolutely have to be evaluated in detail as appropriate. So you understand O&M operations, redundancy, impacts, and mitigation strategies. So this is a good starting point, but there's some more detail that needs to go into that. Okay, pre and post fire actions, new guidance. Again, kind of just the overall thinking through the program. At the end, what we're really focused on getting are pre-disaster preparedness plans and post-disaster preparedness plans. So with a focus on as many watershed and landscape scale projects that we can do before fire that mitigates post-fire hazards, and then working to implement those over time. And then being prepared, that post-disaster preparedness plan is that playbook for after a fire occurs and really gives you the opportunity to work with federal, state, all of your local agencies, and really dive into this quickly. Because what we had seen on so many post-fire recovery efforts was that it took several months, partly to do all the analysis and everything, and then understand where the risk was before we could do anything out in the field. And this is supposed to be a head start once you have a wrap. So we released and developed this identifying actions to mitigate post-wildfire risk. This was just released in March. Um, Big thanks to Michael Blazewicz and Katie Ott who did the heavy lifting on this fact sheet. And I did want to mention actually the hydrology fact sheet. Right Water Engineers really did the heavy lifting on that, so wanted to acknowledge them as well. But the fact sheet here really helps to kind of think through identifying actions to mitigate post-fire risk. One, the idea of connecting hazards, that hazards piece to post-fire susceptibility, and it kind of plays into the next piece, which is connecting susceptibility to mitigation. And then this provides some mitigation action examples. It's not comprehensive, so please don't think that these are the only options you have in doing mitigation, but it kind of provides a framework for evaluating projects as you're working through your planning effort. Um, there's two kind of actions that are talked about within this fact sheet, the operational actions and the physical actions. And we'll get into operational thinking about actions that focus on policies, planning, public engagement to reduce the impact or likelihood of hazards. And the physical actions are probably the things we kind of gravitate and think about right away is what actions are physically implemented on the landscape. So kind of these two different sides, and it's a good reminder that we don't always have to go out and implement a construction project to mitigate risk. There's other things we can do. Early warning systems being one of those things. We have a early warning systems template scope of work that you guys can build off of if you are going to do early warning systems. Um, Preparedness planning, thinking about redundancy in your water supplies. Those are all things that don't take necessarily physical construction. Whereas on the physical action side, we're looking at physical actions we can take, forest management to lessen the severity of the to lessen burn severity, protecting assets, like such as thinking about increased culvert crossing capacity, and then restoration, stream restoration, riverscape restoration projects that mitigate sediment and provide flood storage. So just kind of looking at a couple of examples of this on the operational side, here's warning systems, and then on the physical side, that riverscape restoration. And again, it kind of starts to get at this idea of when you're developing these projects, thinking about timelines, what's the purpose of my project? What are the benefits of doing the project? Gets into some example strategies and some resources for those. So work through that, take a look at it. It kind of feeds into this next fact sheet that we developed, again kind of was released side by side with that, which is data and GIS for RAPs. We've always had a project data sheet put together, but we've updated it since, and now it's in a spreadsheet format. Um, and this fact sheet kind of goes through all of those attributes and fields and kind of provides some descriptions on what information should go in there. So please take a look at that. It's meant to be relatively easy. It's got a lot of pull downs rather than you guys, putting in a lot of details. And when it gets to things like costs, it provides some high level guidance so you don't get too in the weeds. Just gives you some perspective of what we're looking for. It's not meant to be the end all detail. It's just meant to really be a tool for local watershed coalitions as they think about next steps, which is probably going to be going for grant funding and really providing them with enough information for that. Quickly, this is what the data and GIS or the project data sheet looks like. You can get that action plan SOW supporting documents. That's where it's located right now. So I just wanted to let you know. Or if you can't find it, please let me know and I can send that to you. And you can see the descriptions are on here too, so that you can get at that. This fact sheet also provides some information on some basic GIS data we'd like for projects to be delivered. Final thing, other program updates. we've created a spot to put completed wraps up on the Wildfire Ready Watershed page. We're just finalizing the links and details to that. The button's already on there. It says take me to completed Wildfire Ready action plan. So that's where you're going to be able to find that probably within the next week. Some of those will be up there. We also completed the stream crossing guidance document back in October of last year. If any of you have seen that, provides some insights into thinking about planning and design for roadway crossings, other types of crossings, ways to improve that. And then upcoming fact sheets that I've got on my mind to develop as part of the program, that gridded risk identification procedure, that VAR density analysis, at least providing some background on that, and then connecting that stream assessment piece of that scope of work, kind of what the purpose of that is, and just kind of maybe defining that a little bit better. So those are some upcoming fact sheets that we plan on working on. And that's it for me today. Just a couple key takeaways. The program continues to evolve. New guidance is regularly being developed by the technical assistance team to support your planning teams and sponsors. So keep a lookout for those things. We try to let everybody know when they come out. And getting into this Q&A, we wanted you to know that, improving this Wildfire Ready program and Wildfire Ready action plans is all about collaboration with all of you and sharing challenges and successes so that those can be integrated into our guidance. The whole idea is that we can take the best of what everybody puts together here, work together, and keep improving the process. Thanks.
Thank you, Jeff. Really appreciate your presentation, and certainly did a good job getting through all of that content. So we have a few questions that have teed up in the chat, and if others have questions, please add those there. I want to actually start. Kimberly, I'll come back to your question, but Lisa asked, what is the TA team? And Kim Lemberg thinks Kim did respond that it's the CWCB Technical Assistance Team. But if you want to just share how do you fit in there, and just share a little bit more about your role and how you function as a team. And Jeff, if you want to take that question, or I can punt it to someone else.
I don't know, Chris, if you want to say something, but we've as a technical team, we meet on a regular basis. We talk about things, and we specifically talk about program challenges. Um, for interaction with all of you, I think that I just want you to know that we're readily available to answer questions. And that was kind of my point, kind of going throughout the presentation. We've had some teams that reach out a lot, and it doesn't bother us one bit. In fact, I really appreciate when people reach out to ask questions, because I think this program is kind of challenging. I think from a technical analysis side, it can be particularly challenging, kind of working through like, what am I doing on this hazards analysis, and how do I not break the bank? I mean, I got to be practical. I'm a consultant too, and like we want to make sure that all of you, are able to get these things done, meet the program goals and objectives, and still be able to meet your budget and schedule requirements. And I think, as far as reaching out with questions, probably always start with Chris, Andre, and Steve Reeves, and they can kind of forward that to us. And I don't know, Chris, if you have, we've had folks reach directly out to us as a technical assistance team, and that's totally fine with me. We always make sure we kind of provide that feedback of who's talking to us back to CWCB. But don't, if you want to ask a pure up technical question, you can reach out to myself. Some of the other folks on the team that you could reach out to, Natalie Collar's really kind of been handling the debris flow and hill slope erosion side. Tim Fry here at Olson's been handling the H&H questions. Michael Blazowitz and Katie Yacht can be available for questions related to fluvial hazard zones. So hopefully some of that provides some background on a TA team, how we work.
Thanks, Jeff. And Chris, yeah, go for it.
Yeah, and that's a lot of folks. Thanks for mentioning all of them, Jeff. But just simply stated, the CWCB's technical assistance team are our consultants that help us with the watershed program. The Wildfire Ready Watershed program is nested within our watershed program. We do a lot of other things. At any given time, we're managing tens of millions of dollars worth of grants. We are not just a financial stakeholder in that process. We're also a technical stakeholder as well. So our technical assistance team really helps us keep up with a lot of different things. Jeff just outlined what they're doing for wildfire ready watersheds. But we also do things like design review. We do monitoring. We develop new programs. The Colorado Fluvial Hazard Zone program, something we've been working on for years. This technical assistance team, in cooperation with CWCB staff, developed the Wildfire Ready Watersheds program. So you'll hear that a lot, TA team or technical assistance team, and simply stated, those are the CWCB's consultants.
Thanks, Chris. I want to go to Kimberly's question on curious about the process and recommended timelines for updating RAPs once they're completed. If a stakeholder identifies a project following the development of a RAP, how can they get that project added?
And I'd love to jump in on that one. Kimberly, what a wonderful question. Thanks so much for asking it. I'll go after the second piece first. And Jeff, this is something we might consider as guidance at some point. But what I'm advising folks to do is to keep your reps alive in some way. You all have stakeholder groups. A lot of you have a core stakeholder group that's managing the process. And my recommendation is that the core stakeholder group have some type of way, decision-making process to add new projects, so that some stakeholder might come forward with an identified project that wasn't initially identified and say to you, the core group, hey, we think this is really going to meet the objectives and vision of the RAP, and we want to talk to you about it. And if the core stakeholder group agreed with that, they could add it to the RAP without going through another planning process, having to come in for another grant to do it. I think this could simply be done by addendum, but there's other ways to do it as well. What's important about that is a lot of funding sources, including the CWCB's funding source for watershed projects, will not fund projects that aren't identified in a plan. And sometimes we just miss those opportunities, those projects. So we should have a relatively easy way for the stakeholders to make decisions about adding new projects. As far as the timeline for updating RAPs, I haven't thought about that a ton. Some people would say this needs to be done every 5 years, but there's no like regulatory oversight here. For me, I'd like to say let's try to implement a substantive amount of the projects that you're identifying, learn from that as we're doing it, and then have discussions along the way with our stakeholders about what needs to be changed. Does anything need to be changed? Do we want to do a full-blown update? So that's a long-winded way of me saying that the CWCB is certainly flexible in our thinking about when it should be done, but please don't ask to do it before you've implemented a bunch of projects.
Thanks, Chris. And I've gotten a couple questions here about contact information for Jeff, for you, for others on the technical assistance team. Is that information on your website, or where can people find that information?
It's certainly on the website, my contact information, and I will put it in the chat here too. And I recommend that if you have any questions for myself or the technical assistance team, it's probably just easiest to go straight to me, unless you already have some connections with Jeff and the rest of the team. And I could certainly make sure that we get the right folks to answer those questions.
Thanks, Chris. Another question that came up from Lisa Lewis. I represent a very small metro district that has agricultural watershed issues. Do you offer ArcGIS classes? It seems like we need to know the basics. Go for it, Chris.
Okay. No, we do not offer ArcGIS classes. As it relates to this program, we're happy to talk to folks about what type of GIS data is needed to move forward with a wildfire ready action plan, and can also help guide on who the best folks in your community are to contact that have that data and also who have in-house GIS expertise.
I wouldn't
Jeff,
know.
anything to fill in there?
Yeah, the only thing I would note, and it doesn't really get at this kind of need for training, but there is a GIS preparedness for wildfire planning and recovery fact sheet that we developed early on in the program. And if you haven't read that, please do take a look at that. Provide some kind of overall thoughts about the data that we're pulling together for wildfire ready action plans and what that looks like, and gives you at least a good starting point for as you start to talk to stakeholders and partners about the GIS data they might have available.
Thanks, Jeff. Um, if you want to link that particular resource, that would
Mhm.
be great. And what I'll say, Lisa, is that River Network also sometimes provides like one-off trainings related to ArcGIS. Um, so that's something to keep your eye out on as well. And I'll put a link in the chat to our resources. Okay. It looks like, Lisa, if you didn't see in the chat, um, Ashley's asked you to connect, Ashley Garrison with the Colorado Water Conservation Board's asked you to connect with the Blue River Watershed Group because they're leading in Summit County on a RAP. We have a question from Carolyn. Oh, we will be sharing the recording. And I hope everybody stick around because we got some really excellent presentations coming up. Okay, let's see. Brad, I'm going to read this, Jeff, out loud. The grid approach for susceptibility looks nice, but has limitations by not considering hazards that occur higher in the watershed or in tributaries outside of that grid that ultimately co-affect values at risk. For example, the debris flow that impacted, and I don't know how to pronounce that, Strontia Springs Reservoir started 11 miles upstream and would not have been in the grid with that reservoir. So that's more of a comment. I don't know if others, if Chris
I,
or, yeah.
yeah, I can, it's Strontia, by the way, Chelsea. Um, yeah, Brad, of course it's not perfect. We've got to start somewhere to get our stakeholders thinking about where the concentration of their values at risk are located. That doesn't necessarily mean that the mitigation projects are located in the same place. And, I think Julie Dubin and others could speak to this as well, as once that information goes out to the stakeholders, then it's time to get that local knowledge in. Where are these incredibly important values at risk that might be standalone, or that could have been missed, are located? So that's a really important part of the process, is to have the stakeholder input once the initial analysis is done. Anything to add, Jeff?
Yeah, I will say what you don't see when I do that presentation is that we've been working with our partners on ways to not just look at the impact like say like right where the debris flow occurred, but we are looking at downstream impacts as well and looking at how that routes through the system. Might not be perfect. And that's kind of why I said, the gridded analysis is a good starting point. It's not the end all by any means. But when I do this write up, you'll start to kind of see the ways that we're looking at taking those debris flows through flow paths, kind of taking them sometimes in some cases down through the river systems so that we can see where they impact downstream values. So more to come on that, Brad, but I think it's a good point and I appreciate your thoughts on that.
Thank you, Jeff. Um, I'm curious if anyone else on the technical team wanted to share anything or had any, we haven't had any other questions come through, but if there are points you thought might be good to make, Andrea, Michael, Katie, Stephen, anybody?
Chelsea, I wanted to remind everyone that on the landing page for the program's website, There are links to a short video that we produced. I believe there's a podcast interview with Chris, as well as maybe a overview presentation, and just giving some of the folks on the call might be bringing this back to uh, stakeholders that don't need this level of detail, but maybe are still just trying to wrap their heads around the program. So I wanted to make sure that folks know that those are there. They're about halfway, 2/3 of the way down on the landing page for the Wildfire Ready Watersheds program.
Thanks, Michael.
And then I can also add, with regard to the susceptibility discussion, which I have found to be the most creative piece of the Wildfire Ready Watersheds work, and possibly also the most challenging, is that I kind of, based on what I've been seeing and what I've been doing, the approach is really going to depend on the geography of your watershed and the relationship between the values at risk and where the hazards are. In some watersheds, the values at risk are immediately adjacent to the hazards. They're in burn areas, they're in debris flow paths, and that kind of takes one approach to do an effective susceptibility analysis. And then I'm working in another watershed where the values at risk are significantly downstream of the hazard. And that kind of takes a different approach to executing kind of an effective susceptibility analysis. So I would say that, from my perspective, as teams approach susceptibility, it really is an opportunity to take a step back and examine the relationship between your values at risk and each individual hazard, and then develop a approach, whether it be GIS or otherwise, that allows you to explain that relationship, and then sets up your team for the most important part of the susceptibility analysis, which is figuring out what the mitigation measures are.
Yeah, thank you, Katie. I know you've been doing some really cool stuff and really some hard thinking about all this. And I wanted y'all to know, once again, like when I kind of show this idea of maybe a gridded analysis, it's something that I've been kicking around and developing and would like to make available to folks, so that they can do it. But to Katie's point, each of you, you guys are really, you are the leading experts in a lot of these things, and you have a lot of great ideas. And don't take anything that we're recommending as the end all. Please do develop different methodologies if you think they're appropriate. And from my side, on the curiosity and really just wanted to improve the program, I want to see what you guys are doing and coming up with, and how they can apply and how they can improve outcomes on RAPs. So just wanted to push that out for myself.
Thanks, Jeff. Okay. I am going to keep us moving along. Thank you so much to Jeff and the rest of the technical assistance team for this discussion. I am thrilled to move us into our case studies presentations, where we're going to hear all about lessons learned from our different speakers on their different aspects of their plans. So I'm going to hand it over first to Annie Berleman with the Colorado Springs Utilities on transitioning from planning to implementation and project monitoring. Take it away.
All right, everything look good?
Looks great.
Awesome, thank you. Again, my name is Annie Berleman. I'm with Colorado Springs Utilities. I'm the Fountain Creek Watershed Project Manager, and we had an opportunity to go from planning right into implementation. Somewhat, we were building the bike while riding it, and that's okay, but so I'm going to talk about transitioning from the planning work that we did into our implementation project. To set the stage, Colorado Springs Utilities has a very vast system that we move and convey our water through. It consists of 7 different collection systems. We have 4 Trans Mountain diversion tunnels and 4 major pipelines that bring water to Colorado Springs. If anybody's been to Colorado Springs, you will notice it's a very large city with a very tiny creek in its backyard. So therefore, we have to import around 80% of our water from trans-basin, trans-mountain diversions. The other 20% of our water comes from our local reservoirs and local watersheds. So we do try to keep 3 years of our water demand storage and 3 years of water demand in storage. We have 25 different reservoirs. So the risk to our reservoirs must be mitigated, because taking any one or a group of reservoirs off our system would be very impactful for us and our customers. We do have 6 water treatment plants. We deliver about 233 million gallons a day, and we have over 2,100 miles of distribution pipeline. We do have 2 resource recovery facilities and one solid handling facility, and we reclaim about 38 million gallons a day. We do have the oldest non-potable system in Colorado, and that's about 11% of our water portfolio. So we take our water resources very seriously. And to kick that off over to the Wildfire Ready Watershed Planning Grant, we really wanted to do our RAP a little bit differently. You will notice that our watersheds that we looked at are much smaller than some of those other watersheds on the map that Jeff shared. And that was because we really wanted to dig down into some higher resolution on our 4 major reservoirs that we wanted to protect. So back in 2004, we got a $130,000 RAP action plan. And in that, we went through all of the processes that Jeff talked about. We had our goals and objectives, we had our data needs and gap analysis done, then we went into our hazard assessments. And through that hazard assessment, we were able to identify some risks that we needed to mitigate. We also recognized that we had some areas that low-tech process-based restoration, that LT-PBR, could be done. And we looked at some of our hydraulics, and that helped support some of our restoration goals that we have set out. We also looked at our debris flows and susceptibility, and that fed directly into what we wanted to do for implementation. So those unidentified risks were just a huge factor for us when we wanted to look at implementation projects. We had some issues with our forest health. We had conifer encroachment into our riparian areas. We had overly decadent rich conifer forests that were closed canopy. We had lost some of our aspen stands and things like that. You can see on the right that through this grant, through the identified risk, we were able to move into implementation and do some forestry work. And here's some upland you can see. This particular prescription in the center photo took out quite a few trees and really opened up that canopy. And then we were trying to actually remove the biomass from the landscape. So that's the picture on the right-hand side. We also recognized that we had some undersized culverts. So for debris flow and things like that, these were huge risks. If we had a wildfire, the debris flow would be clogged up with log jams. It increases maintenance. It would block us from reaching some of our infrastructure and things like that. And then on North Catamount Creek, which I'm going to be talking a whole lot about here in a minute, we recognized that we had historical beaver meadows, and we could bring those historical beaver meadows back. The creek channel, unfortunately, when the beavers left, the creek became incised, the riparian area dried out a little bit, we had the conifers encroaching, and we lost our really great fuels break. So that those risks to our infrastructure was identified in our planning. And then also on South Catamount, we noted we had some infrastructure at risk. We have an interesting configuration of infrastructure, and right above it, we had a lot of decadent forests and things like that. So we're going to be looking at doing some planning and analysis on South Catamount on how we can better protect our infrastructure. So on North Catamount Creek, here's a little preview of it. The upper right-hand photo, it was taken in 2005, and you can see that there are 2 to 3 nice historical beaver ponds that are, flowing, and everything's nice and green and luscious, and that's great. And then the bottom right-hand corner, sometime between 2005 and 2017, we lost all of our beavers, mostly due to habitat and some other loss. And anyways, the creek has become incised, things have kind of dried out, and we lost that really great fuels break. And the upper left-hand picture is actually a picture of a breached beaver dam. If you zoomed in really close, you could actually see like the little chew marks on the sticks and things like that. And these beaver dams became breached, and then the ponds had drained. And the lower left-hand picture is actually one of my favorites. You see there's a very long, long chunk of grass there. And that grass is not actually growing taller. It's growing on top of a historical beaver dam. It's about 2.5 feet tall. So if you were to walk, that grass seems like it's taller, but it's not. It's just perched above the rest of the floodplain there. So we did identify in our planning that we had a really great opportunity to really sink in and do some low-tech process-based restoration on this creek. So in 2004, we went ahead and applied for the implementation portion of the Wildfire Ready watersheds. We were awarded $1.37 million total. We have $1.4 million in match through some of our other forestry projects. And if you look at the map to the right, the orange kind of polygons is a lot of our match project work that we've been doing. And then the green and blue polygons are our forestry projects. We have both upland forestry projects and removing conifers from the riparian area, again, opening up that canopy and allowing aspen to grow and reduce some of that wildfire risk right there. And then in the bottom of North Catamount Creek, we have our low-tech process-based restoration, which again, we had evidence of historical beaver, and we're really excited. We really think this can be a very successful low-tech process-based restoration project in North Catamount Creek. Another reason we had to hustle really hard to get from planning to implementation, but there's an opportunity for us to actually have an adaptive management portion as well. So we're going to do construction this year in 2025, and then we're going to have at least 1 year of adaptive management in 2026, where we can go back in and adjust this project and really fine tune it. And that was a huge opportunity for us and a key driver on why we wanted to hustle. And even though we weren't completely done with our planning process and our wrap wasn't totally finished, we wanted to make the jump into implementation. On the slide here, you can see about all the bits and pieces and parts of what we asked for with the grant and what we received for the grant there. We are including 2 to 3 culvert replacements, and we are going to look at protecting our South Catamount reservoir infrastructure. So a large chunk of what we're going to be doing with North Catamount Creek, we are very, very fortunate that CWCB has a beaver wetland restoration response study going. And I saw that Joel's name was on the meeting list here. So if he wants to jump in and comment on this, feel free. We are being able to monitor the bejesus out of this project. We have 40 years of flow data, or sorry, we have flow data going back to the 1940s, and we have 40 years of water quality data just in our regular routine sampling. So Joel and CWCB came in and offered this monitoring opportunity. We jumped at it. The monitoring really wants to look at how does low-tech process-based restoration influence surface and subsurface flows, which this is a question we have from a water utility perspective of, will this project improve our reliability and consistency of flows? And those subsurface flows, what does that look like? We've never measured that before. And we're hoping that, again, restoring those subsurface flows, we also restore the riparian corridor, which leads to a very massive 1.5-mile fuels break, again, protecting our infrastructure. And then our system is a very erodible system. It's a lot of decomposed granite. So this is also going to be looking at how does low-tech process-based restoration influence sediment, deposition and erosion and things like that. So CWCB monitoring is going to include stream flow gauging, water table monitoring. We have 7 subsurface monitoring wells. We'll be looking at sediment. There'll be ground surveys that'll be done and photo points. And then Colorado Springs Utilities is going to bring our flow data to the table, as well as our water quality monitoring. And then we also we just recently got a drone program in our system. And so we are going to be doing LiDAR and photogrammetry. We have that both pre-project, we'll do it post-project, and then we'll do it through the adaptive management as well. So we're going to have really high density LiDAR, and then the photogrammetry has just been pretty amazing. So the photos here, that's what this is demonstrating. The upper center photo is looking at the upstream flow gauge and looking at flows there. The left-hand photo is the subsurface flows of the monitoring wells. This photo is showing 2. There's actually a third behind there, but it's hard to see. And then the right-hand photo is actually an image taken from our drone when it was doing its preliminary LiDAR flight. So here is, we are really excited about the LiDAR. Here's low-tech process-based restoration meets our high-tech monitoring. If you will note, there are some orange-yellow arrows, and those arrows are pointing from upstream to downstream and pointing at that center conifer. So the upper left-hand picture, you see there's a conifer there. It's encroached into riparian zone. It's actually growing out of an old historical beaver dam. And in the right-hand image, you can see that that's where our fuel reduction treatment came in and removed those conifers. And that creek is like taking a very sharp turn and running right along that historic beaver dam. And then the lower left-hand image is just the point cloud from one of our initial LiDAR flights. And you can see the incredible resolution we're going to be getting. So we really hope that we can measure the side channels that beavers create, and the floodplain and everything else like that, and be able to monitor this over time. So that is my presentation. Does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, I wanted to just thank you so much, Annie. Mention that Annie will have to skedaddle a little early from the meeting, so we'll take just 2 minutes for any questions. After that, you can put your questions in the chat.
I answered all of your implementation questions. That's amazing.
If it's easier too, you can come off chat or off mic, but we'll just. Here we go. We got one from Barrett. Prior to the wrap, did you anticipate the low-tech process-based restoration projects, or did those arise during?
That did arise through our wrap. So no, we had not planned on doing that prior to doing our wrap analysis. So that was great. We recognized what a wonderful project area we have, and that we actually could, even though our wrap wasn't finished, that we could actually go for implementation funding, just because it was such a good process.
And it looks like I jumped over Troy's question. Aside from beaver reintroduction, have you had any other success with nature-based solutions?
This will be Colorado Springs Utilities' first take at low-tech process-based restoration. We do a lot of restoration projects on Fountain Creek, but it is a completely different animal entirely. It's urban, it's in size, it's erodible. And so those projects look really different. So this is our first take at doing this gentle touch, more low-tech process-based restoration in our watershed. So this is new for us.
Great. And we'll just do this one last question and just a quick response. What's the more proactive implementation approach? Trying to mitigate the severity of the burn or severity of the flooding?
We endeavor to do both. And that's why this implementation project, we're so excited about it, because we did forestry work. We tied in new forestry work through the grant with historical forestry projects to help reduce that severity and really bring that burn severity scores down significantly. And then again, the low-tech process-based restoration, it's kind of belt and suspenders. Should we have a fire? We have this wonderful cleaning system that would bring sediment out and actually improve our water quality and help protect our reservoirs. So this is what we were so excited about, is we were able to take this really holistic approach between forestry, health, and then the health of our riparian zone as well. So we're going for both.
Thanks, Annie. Thank you so much for your presentation. We're going to move on to the next presentation, and just for the audience's awareness, we'll hold the rest of the questions till the end so that we have space for a full Q&A. I'm going to pass it over to Angie, and Angie, I'm sharing your slides, right? Are you sharing your slides?
I can do them.
Perfect, good.
Keep it easy on you. All right. Perfect. I'm Angie Davlin. I run the.
We only see your desktop right now.
Oh, let me fix that.
And Annie, they're looking for your contact information if you want to throw that in the chat, and I'll share it afterwards as well.
Oh, okay. Yeah, perfect. We'll do.
Okay, how's that? Is that working, Chelsea?
Sorry, yes, I was muted. You're good.
No, good. Perfect. All right, thanks. I'm Angie Davlin. I run the Wildfire Collaborative for the Roaring Fork Valley. And I'm going to talk to you today about how to bridge the divide between watershed and wildfire. So I'll share a couple things. First, I'll spend a little bit of time framing out the challenge, which I think is something probably many of you are well aware of. I'll talk about some strategies that we've used to collaborate across the aisle or across those fields. And then I'll talk a little bit about a timeline for that collaboration. So specific times in your RAP or your prospective RAP where you might want to think about pulling in broader groups of stakeholders or narrowing groups of stakeholders for better impact. All right, so first the challenge. We know that post-fire events, exactly what these RAPs are trying to accomplish, directly threaten water quality and infrastructure. And yet, it seems to me that neither the wildfire groups nor the water groups are solely wanting to own this problem. In the Roaring Fork Valley where we work, there are lots of different organizations within both watershed and wildfire spaces that have different objectives, but there isn't any cross-field collaboration across those groups. And so we thought of this as a really great opportunity to bring those two teams together to talk about post-fire hazards. And then third, we know that the wildfire groups and the watershed groups often lack that shared knowledge base. And as a result, that planning often happens in silos and that data is stored in silos. And even though we have some great overlapping objectives, it can be difficult, even just from a communication standpoint, to ensure that both of those fields are aware of the hazards and the problems and the opportunities that the other spaces can make available. Okay, so what can we do about that? One of the things that was really critical to our early success was cementing early collaboration with a cross-field or an across-the-aisle partner. So even before we wrote the grant for our RAP, we reached out to our local watershed group, which here in the Roaring Fork Valley is the Roaring Fork Conservancy, and got them on board. They were so great in helping us think through kind of the language of water, which was quite foreign to me as someone in the wildfire space, and how we might go about outreach and goal setting with groups that don't typically come together in the same room. Secondly, at the point that we had been awarded the RAP, we really wanted to celebrate that and get people engaged. We didn't have a lot of momentum from our counties, our municipalities, our fire districts, or our stakeholders at the point when we were writing the grant for the project. In fact, it didn't feel like anyone was very excited about the problem or about the opportunity that a RAP could provide. But at the point that we secured funding, those stakeholders came together and they were really excited about what we could produce with the funding that we had secured. So we had an early stakeholder meeting and we had about 75 stakeholders there. We had the state team, the Water Conservation Board that came in to help lead that meeting, and plus kind of some of our early excited partners who helped. And we felt at that point it was really important to show the need for the RAP using data, and the picture of that statewide post-fire susceptibility assessment map is something that I've become really comfortable talking about. It was new to me at the time, and because our area, which, can you see my pointer?
Yes, it's small, but it's up in the right corner for all those looking.
Yes, is this bright red area here kind of one of the most hazardous areas outside of the Front Range? This data piece is really compelling to a lot of different people. I also learned early in the process that it was critical to make language accessible to everyone. Being fairly new to wildfire myself at the time, I really underestimated how foreign the language of water and post-fire hazards was to most every single stakeholder that was there. And so while they were impressed with kind of the technical presentation that we did, a lot of them came to me afterwards and said, hey, like, I trust what you're doing. It seems like the need is high, but we really were lost in the wording there. And so I made the wrong assumption that I was the least informed and knowledgeable person in the room. And if I could do it over again, I would bring that language down to something that lay people could understand. We also use that early meeting to generate excitement. So even though it feels silly to celebrate something at stage one, we found it was really important to get people excited about what that wrap could bring, and then use that to ask for match funding, which we hadn't yet secured at the time. We felt confident that we could get there. We had some strategies for kind of plan B funding, but we also really wanted to treat that match as an all hands in opportunity to get small contributions across sectors. So we tried to find a right sized, won't impact your budget request for a wide variety of stakeholders. And if you're planning your wrap, these are some kind of buckets of stakeholder groups that might be helpful to you as you think about, who might be a contributor. And the size of our contributions ranged from $500 on the low end. A couple $1,000s was our target for most of the organizations that are represented here. $3,000 to $500. $3,000 to $5,000 to match in the tens of thousands of dollars for other entities. I think by starting small, asking a broad array of stakeholders for a small amount of money, and really framing that as, we hope that you can find a contribution that does not adversely impact your budget, really helped us get a lot of people to be willing to contribute quickly. We also laid the foundation for that match request at that first stakeholder meeting. So people were excited. There were a lot of people in the room. We didn't do a paddle raise, but it kind of felt like that sort of energy where we were getting people almost to commit on the spot by saying in that meeting, we're going to come to you in a few weeks, we're going to ask you to contribute. And just by stating that, not twisting anyone's arm, a lot of people actually volunteered. They said, like, you can count us in. That made it easy for me, a week later to say, thank you so much for committing to that match at our meeting. I'm here to invoice you for it. We also wanted to celebrate our successes. So our community members weren't necessarily that informed of this opportunity. And so every time we would get a new match donor, we would do a media release. And here's an example of one that made the front page of the Aspen Times. Just trying to find any opportunity to bring more partners and more stakeholders into this sphere, and to inform our community members about the exciting thing that we were doing. Lastly, outside of that original rah-rah kind of momentum creation, now we're in the stretch. We're kind of through the data gathering phase. We need to continue to keep folks engaged, and so we've created some experiences for fire and water professionals to come together to understand each other's challenges, ideally in the field, kind of firsthand seeing what those things are. And we're planning more, knowing that these have been some of our most powerful tools at getting people excited. And this is a picture here of going to an intake site, which was really just amazing experience for me and other people to see, where does our water come from and how vulnerable it could be to post-fire hazards that might include ash or flooding. Another space where I wish someone would have told me earlier, don't assume that people have this knowledge, don't assume that people are aware of these things, and don't assume they have the technical language or vocabulary that you might think they do. All right, the third thing I want to talk to you about is just a general timeline for the collaboration that we've used, which might be helpful to you as you think about, where can we draw more partners in? So here's the work that we've done to date. So before we even wrote the grant, I reached out to other organizations that had written grants that were in the process of writing for a wrapper that had already secured one to ask for advice, and that was really helpful. If that's you at the stage of you're considering a wrap or writing a wrap, please use me. I'm happy to share some of the mistakes that we made and some of the successes that we've had. In the yellow there, during the grant writing process, like I mentioned before, we found that cross-sector partner who was able to look at that wrap with water-focused eyes that I didn't have. And if you're a water person, maybe you find a fire partner that can kind of help you think about what you might be missing. Right after we received the award, we quickly expanded our group to engage stakeholders. And then at the point we actually started working on the project, we shrunk that group down to formalize a working team. And so you probably want both your extra large group of people and then your people who are actually doing the work and knowing kind of the right size ask for different stages of this. And then Jeff mentioned that the data collection phase is so critical. He's absolutely right. And that was another opportunity to think critically about who are your right stakeholders in that. They're probably not the people that you've already been working with. They're probably someone on the technical side of that agency who has access to a lot of data. And so we found that personalized outreach, which, using that snowball approach of going to our stakeholder and asking them to kind of push that person on their team to get us data was really critical. We did not have much success with broad outreach, especially when that outreach was done by our engineering partner. It took a lot more personal phone calls than I thought that it might, but those really paid off. And then what's in the future for us, some other places that we're planning for, collaboration across the aisle is coming up in the recommendations phase. We really want to make sure that our data is relevant to people. And so we're planning in some field days to get the engineers on site with key stakeholders to make sure that the data that our incredible Right Water team has is as localized as possible and getting the firsthand experience and kind of engagement with those partners. At the point that we're prioritizing, we'll know we'll need to re-engage our stakeholders in a big way. This will be at least 18 months after we launched it. We want to make sure that we haven't lost people in that process and really kind of re-engage and re-energize them, knowing that this is an important part to set the groundwork for project ownership. So we want people advocating for projects that are in their area and kind of raising their hands and saying, like, I want this to be a top priority and I'm willing to lead it. And then that swings us into the implementation phase, knowing that the Wildfire Collaborative cannot own every single project that we'll want to do out of this wrap, and we'll need to kind of build up our deck of leaders who will carry these things forward and step into a project management or kind of a collaboration facilitation phase going there. This is me. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions. And I just want to say thanks to we couldn't have done this without the state, without Chris, without our partners at Right Water, and without a lot of the stakeholders that I showed you on that slide helping us kind of carry this thing forward.
Thank you so much, Angie. I really appreciate your description and just the cross-sector collaboration. A reminder, we'll hold the questions until our other two speakers have had a chance to present. I am going to now pass it to Julie to share her experience.
Great, thank
And
you.
I'll get your slides up right now.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Well, my name is Julie Dubin, and I am the director of Peaks to People Water Fund. I also serve as the coordinator for the Big Thompson Watershed Health Partnership. And this partnership did recently form to prepare communities and natural resources in the Big Thompson watershed to be ready for the impacts of climate change, wildfires, and post-fire flooding. So the Wildfire Ready Action Plan provided just a great process for us and a roadmap. we're a watershed level partnership, and it was a way for us to engage in watershed wide strategic planning. And it is designed to engage all of our varied stakeholders. So it's a great fit for us. Next slide, please.
Perfect. You can see the slide, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
So the next slide is the just a little bit of information about the Big Thompson watershed itself. So it's located in northern Colorado, in Larimer County, and it is somewhat unique in that, in addition to the Big Thompson and Little Thompson rivers, which are both important water sources in our region, it also includes critical infrastructure for the Colorado Big Thompson project, and this is managed by Northern Water. And this Colorado Big Thompson project is the state's largest trans-basin diversion project, and it transports water from the Colorado River Basin to the Front Range and provides water for more than 1 million people across many communities here in northern Colorado. Our watershed is also unique in that it experienced catastrophic floods in both 1976 and 2013. And had some very significant impacts from the Cameron Peak and East Troublesome fires in 2020. So we've had a lot of activity in our watershed. Next slide, please. Thank you. So our RAP scope, because our active stakeholder group spans the whole watershed, we wanted to focus on the full Huck 8 watershed for our RAP, and this is over 800 square miles. So it's really a large scale to be focusing on for our RAP. It is a mix of private and public land in the watershed, including Forest Service and National Park Service land. So our stakeholder group is diverse, and it includes more than 30 different agencies. We have watershed groups, local conservancy district, municipal utilities and water providers, the county, Colorado State Forest Service, and many others. So the diverse group has been involved at key points through the RAP process, including right at the beginning to define our core values as a stakeholder group. And then that key point that Angie brought up, which was providing data sets for those values at risk. And then they are also actively participating in the prioritization process, which is where we are in our process now. Because this is such a large group, though, we did hone in on a core team. And just 4 representative stakeholder groups serve on that core team. And that includes a couple of the watershed coalitions and the Conservation District, and then Peace to People Water Fund. And we work very closely with the technical team for this project, and that's Matrix Design Group. That's our consultant group that we're working with. Next slide, please. So what I'm talking about today is our experience with the Alexander Mountain Fire. That was just a brief background about our RAP, but we did actually experience a fire in our watershed while our RAP was in progress. We initially started the RAP process in the spring of 2023 and had just received our initial draft analysis for the hazard analysis. This is task 4 of the Wildfire Ready Action Plan process for those of you who are in the middle of this. So we did just get our initial draft hazard analysis from Matrix when the fire occurred in late July of 2024. It was a 10,000 acre fire, and it was contained within about 3 weeks. Our stakeholder group started working on planning the post-fire response even before the fire was fully contained. We worked with CWCB and the technical assistance team immediately, even while the fire was still active, to discuss how we might use this partially completed RAP to help with our recovery planning. Jeff alluded to this mentioned this during his presentation, that we did determine that we needed additional modeling that was outside the scope of the original statement of work and budget that we had with Matrix. We were looking at that whole Huck 8 watershed, and then the fire occurred in a small part of the watershed, as Jeff mentioned. So CWCB provided the financial support for Jeff and his team at Olson to take the post-fire data, including the burn area reflectance classification maps. These are BARC maps produced by the Forest Service, and quickly do a more detailed hydrology and hydraulics modeling for the burn area. So they ended up analyzing about 80 square miles. And remember, our whole RAP is covering about 800 square miles. So they were able to utilize the values at risk data sets that we had collected and quickly did a susceptibility analysis to identify areas most at risk. And then the next slide, please, shows the susceptibility analysis. So here you can see the susceptibility analysis map that Olson produced. And what you're looking at, you can see the burn area in red, the perimeter is in red, and within the perimeter you can see burn severity as mapped by the Forest Service, and the lower burn severity areas are in green and higher severity moves from yellow into red. And we also were able to work with the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute to quickly model hill slope erosion in the burn area. So then you can see this grid of hexagons that Jeff talked about. This is the honeycomb that's over the whole area, which includes the burn area, but also goes beyond the burn area. And the hexagons in this case represent an area of about 1/10 of a mile. Hexagons with color represent areas where hazards and our values at risk that we identified intersect. Darker the color means the more susceptible the area. And for us, this analysis reinforced that there were 2 agencies with the most identified risk in the area and the most ability to address that risk. And so that we determined were the county, Larimer County, and the city of Loveland Water and Power. And ultimately, the city of Loveland took the lead on working with NRCS to apply for EWP funds for recovery projects in the burn area. And this was mentioned before, but one of the goals of this RAP is to be able to do this post-fire analysis rapidly. And we did have the analysis available to our stakeholder groups very quickly within about 7 weeks of fire containment. So next slide, please. This is our lessons learned. We learned a lot through this process. First, I'll talk about the H&H modeling, and we've covered this, that the modeling, our original pass at our hydrology and hydraulics modeling was just too broad. And in order to have an actionable analysis, we needed to have a more detailed look. So we were able to do this for the burn area with the help of CWCB and Olson. And then with the additional guidance of CWCB and the technical assistance team, we adjusted the analysis we were doing with Matrix for our whole HUC 8 RAP. So that was one of our big lessons learned. Next is the susceptibility analysis. We got to test out, how did this work in a post-fire scenario? And as I mentioned in the last slide, the city of Loveland took the lead on working with NRCS to apply for those EWP funds for recovery projects. Recovery projects were not identified as part of the susceptibility analysis. So that was something that that we learned, is that the susceptibility analysis was just going to give us those areas of concern. And in this case, the creation of this analysis so quickly did 2 things for us. And the first, I mentioned that it provided us clarity about which agencies were affected by the fire, and it also helped define who should take the lead on planning recovery efforts. And that it also helped our affected stakeholders understand where to focus on their highest risk areas and where to look for potential projects. So for example, it became obvious from the maps that one of the creeks, Cedar Creek, was a concern. And the city looked for historical flow data and put in a monitoring station right away. This actually helped really speed up being able to implement that project right away. Additional projects under consideration include low-tech process-based restoration projects, water quality gauges, check dams, contour felling projects in vulnerable drainages, and some structure protection. So that's all still being defined. Third big lesson we learned was around budget. We were outside of our budget to do the more detailed modeling of the Alexander Mountain Fire burn area. So CWCB stepped in to help us secure funds for those additional analyses that were performed by Jeff and his team at Olson. And then based on what we learned from our experience, we also had to go back and revise our modeling approach for the full wrap area, which was also outside of our budget. So we worked with Matrix and CWCB to figure out the right level of detail and find a way to cover these efforts without having to go back to our stakeholders to provide additional funds. Matrix has been just a great partner in this work in terms of problem solving with us, and has been dedicated to completing the statement of work even under these changing conditions and budget shortfalls. And then CWCB has also been a really supportive partner in the wrap by helping secure additional funds to address some of that budget gap. And I just would say transparency, really honest conversations about where you are in the process and what those gaps are, and then close budget tracking through the process has been really important for us. It did feel like we were all on or continues to feel like we're all on the same team and that we are problem solving together. Our stakeholder group, Matrix, Olson, CWCB, the technical assistance team. It just feels like we're all going toward the same goals here. Last two lessons, the scope. A HUC 8 is a really large area to tackle. For us, it has been really helpful to engage stakeholders across the landscape. We have more than 70 stakeholders representing more than 30 agencies who have an interest in this plan. Our hope is that this plan leads to action, and that's something we're working on facilitating, and that the various stakeholders who've been involved will utilize it. We do think there will be some multi-stakeholder projects, but there will also be some projects that are relevant to just one stakeholder. And then finally, our stakeholders. It was incredibly helpful to establish the stakeholder group and identify those values at risk data sets prior to a fire or other natural disaster. It made it so much easier to work together quickly and efficiently. You know who to connect with, who has a stake in the affected area, and where those values are. And lastly, my overall takeaway is that we tested out the framework of the Wildfire Ready Action Plan, and it was really helpful in enabling a quick and coordinated post-fire planning process, thanks in large part to the additional support of CWCB. So that's it.
Thank you so much, Julie. It looks like you got a question in the chat, but I'm going to actually pass it over to Andy to keep us moving along here. So Andy, I'll let you share screen, or I can do it for you.
Great, thanks. I can, let me pull it up here. Give me a second. Just wait for everything to kind of catch up to me. Can you all see that okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right. Hi, everybody. My name's Andy Rossi. I'm the general manager of the Upper Yampa Water Conservancy District up here in Routt County, Steamboat Springs, Colorado. And I'm gonna give you a quick sort of run through of some of the details of our Bear River Wildfire Ready Action Plan that's done. And what's good for me about going last is hearing these other presenters. I can see a lot of what I am gonna share with you reflected in their efforts. So I think we'll just get into it here. So sort of the nuts and bolts of what we did here is we had two sort of concurrent efforts going on here. We had the Wildfire Ready Action Plan in the Bear River. It's a much different scale than what you just heard from Julie. We only focus on about 50 square miles, and I'll get into why we chose to do that. We've got some project costs there, and we started in late 2023. We did a lot of extensive ground truthing in 2024. I think this is really important as you're trying to develop these wraps. You know, it goes back to that sort of older tenet of hydrology 101. You should never work on a watershed you haven't walked across. I believe in that, and I really believe in it for these processes as well. The final report was delivered just early 2025. And at the same time, we were very fortunate to be able to get a successful grant award from the Co-swap program under DNR, and that's for forestry and vegetation management, to be applied within the boundary of our RAP project. That's going to be about a $1.3 million project. Most of the money coming from the Co-swap grant, and we're currently right now working through the final stages of our proposed action categorical exclusion with the Forest Service, and we hope to be on the ground in 2025. So from sort of that initial project development to maybe the first, implementation on the ground, you're talking about 24 months at a smaller scale RAP, if that helps anybody as far as, what they're thinking of timeline of implementation. And right now, besides this forestry project, we're looking at all the other stuff that came out of the RAP. And I will say we probably come up with about 10 plus years of non-forestry projects. So that's sort of the overall scope of where we've gotten so far. To kind of orient you where we're working here, we are working at the headwaters of the Yampa River. So the picture on the left is a picture of the Flat Tops Wilderness here. The reservoir in the forefront there is Yamcola Reservoir. That's one of the reservoirs that we built, we operate. You can see there's other reservoirs there. It's a pretty diverse landscape. And if you follow over to the other part of the screen, you can see the reservoirs up here. And then downstream, you can see there's probably 24 or so different agricultural irrigation operations downstream. There's the town of Yampa right here, another town, Phippsburg, and of course, all the way downstream is Stagecoach Reservoir. So I had an opportunity when we first were considering, how big to go here. I originally thought I'd work from Stagecoach up, and ultimately made the decision to work from the town of Yampa up. And that came into my mind from really like considering the problem, not the overall solutions I was looking for, but where could I do the most effective analysis that would have the longest and sort of most far-reaching downstream effect for some mitigation. And it turned out when I really looked at it, if I could just focus on this 50 square miles, I could have some pretty good effect for this entire agricultural community just downstream. So before we get into any more of the specifics, I just want to talk about that concept of sort of focusing on the problem. And I'm borrowing this idea, a little bit from the business world. This is not my original idea, and it's been out there for a while. And it's something that a lot of people like to refer to as you got to fall in love with the problem and not the solution. And I think what we heard from Annie is like the ultimate expression of this. So when you first dive into this wildfire problem, and I'm a water engineer, I'd never thought of this and how to fix things. I knew there was a risk out there. And this set of figures is from a paper that I read when I was trying to come up to speed on everything, and the paper is referenced here at the bottom. But when you first look at things, this sort of pre-wildfire condition of forest in the upper left, when you first kind of think of it, you're like, oh, that's my problem. The forests are loaded for this intense, risky, catastrophic problem, and I need to go out and fix that, right? Well, you've got different options of doing that and just very sort of shorthand. Maybe you go out and do some thinning, maybe you do some controlled burning, or maybe you do some thinning and some controlled burning, and it's going to result in some sort of fire activity and then resulting post-fire condition over here. Well, if you think about it just from like, this is my problem, that the forests are preloaded, you're going to short circuit right here. I need to thin and burn. You're done with your project. No need for a wrap. Go out and start raising about $100 million, because to do that work is incredibly expensive, and trying to do it all over the forest that might be affecting where you're working, it's going to eat up the next 10 years just in fundraising, and I can replace half my staff now with forestry folks, and we'll go out there and we'll just do that. When I really thought about it, where this problem is way too big for any of us to tackle, my real problem is actually way over here. It's this entire column right here And I think this kind of cuts to the heart of what the Wildfire Ready program is all about. We needed to figure out how to live under this full range of post-wildfire conditions. We're not going to be able to get to the ideal across the entire landscape that's at risk. So I really would encourage you all not to just look at this sort of what's this ideal solution, but really how are the community that you're going to work with, how do they live with this full range? Because as you heard from Julie, you might get a fire before you're even done coming up with the solutions. And then you've got to learn how to live with this, even though what you really wanted was this condition right here. So that's just a little sort of how I thought about going about this because I was new to all of this.
2 hour
So,
workshop.
so the next part, once we got into it, what you're going to find early on is that you get your wildfire risk analysis done pretty early in the RAP project. So to orient you, this is the town of Yampa right up here. This is the Bear River corridor running up to the headwaters. Here's Yamcolo Reservoir right here. And so getting that wildfire risk analysis pretty early on is what really allowed us to carry on that co-swap funded fuels mitigation effort simultaneously. All of a sudden, now we have a way to think about how can we start engaging with, in this case, the United States Forest Service on trying to get a fuels mitigation project permitted. Because as you can see, all of our highest wildfire risk areas are in the national forest. So that focuses our effort and lets us think about how to get that started while we're still thinking of all the non-forestry type solutions we're going to come up with. Now, this is early and you're not done. And I think as you heard early on, especially from Jeff and from others, it's time to apply the susceptibility analysis. And this is, again, taking that next step of like falling in love with the problem. This is not your only problem, right? You want to start thinking about if this burns, what happens? And what that looks like is this. So we came up with a combination of 35 different risk assessment scenarios. So we took, the 5 big topics that Jeff identified: hydrologic change, hydraulic, sediment yield, debris flow, and fluvial geomorphic change in a post-fire condition, and analyze them for a whole bunch of different values at risk. So for example, with hydrologic change, what was important to us is source water versus hydrologic plan. How could a wildfire change our source water? Because that's our core business. We store and deliver raw water. And so you went through all that. And please don't be intimidated by sort of this list of 35. You might end up with fewer, you might end up with more. Once you've done sort of the ground truthing and you've really looked into your watershed, this list is actually fairly easy to come up with, I found. What you end up is a much different looking map, right? So now what you've done, if you look at your overall susceptibility analysis, you've shifted where you're going to start looking for solutions down further into your watershed. If you can remember from the first wildfire hazard map I showed you, this area right up here had a high risk of burning. But however, if it does burn, the susceptibility of certain infrastructure and other values at risk was a lot lower. However, down here, closer to the town of Yampa, there was not a high risk of burn, but the resulting post-fire influences way downstream were much greater. This is where we have a big high density of irrigated ag, and there's all kinds of values of risk right along this corridor that we needed to honor and look at. So how do you take this map and the ground truthing and everything else and start coming up with a projects list? Well, we ended up with a matrix of trying to look at what we could do on the ground and where things were most important. This happens to be our pre-fire project recommendation for just a section of it. And so you can see that we've listed all of our smaller areas, these other 7th level watersheds, which we broke it up into. And for example, if you look at the very headwaters area, this is this top row right here. We've got a low wildfire risk. There's not many roads up there. The debris flow was low. We could have had some hill slope erosion. But if this were to burn, its resulting impacts, we're going to be pretty low as far as its chances of propagating downstream. And if you couple that on top of that, you've got a land management restriction. It's all in wilderness. We're not going to be able to do that much. However, you start to move downstream. If you take this Smith Creek area right here, well, there's only one road up to what is this Stillwater Reservoir. And so if something were to interrupt our access to that reservoir, all of a sudden we have a high hazard reservoir that's cut off from operations access. And so what that leads to, of course, is a road crossing and culvert project right here along the road. And we had three main types of solutions that we came up with. We had wildfire severity reduction, that's forestry projects. We had road crossings, and then floodplain improvements. That could be beaver enhancements, floodplain reconnection, all kinds of things that happened. And this is where the ground truthing really came important about looking at what could be done. So how you take this all of a sudden to a project list is these are what I find to be a very important outcome of our wildfire ready action plan are these project data sheets. And these are products that we worked with our consultants with to come up with. And what we end up doing is we've got about a dozen pre-fire projects and a dozen post-fire projects that we'd like to engage with. And what it helped me do was just organize my thoughts about what is the magnitude of what we could do. We've got a name, we've got a project statement sort of over here. Some of the design constraints that came out of, say, maybe H&H modeling. Also some other important aspects like what sort of permit requirements might we require there. We've got some preliminary cost estimates and a preliminary timeline here as well. And then, of course, across the bottom row, we've just got some good photograph and location data there for us to remember, where was it? What does it look like? And again, what this allowed me to do was go back to that original concept of considering the problem and not the solution. So the solution here is a new culvert, and I can rent the equipment and build that pretty easily. The real problem in getting this done came out of organizing our thoughts, and as many of you are probably already kind of considering right now, this road is a Forest Service road. So my real problem is, how do I engage with the United States Forest Service to self-perform a project that I know I can complete in a pretty easy, manner? And I think as you go through trying to organize your thoughts here, those sort of, as you might want to refer to them, critical paths for your projects are going to emerge. And having these sort of project data sheets is important for that. The other thing it's really important for is this is my email back to Chris Sturm all teed up. When I say, hey, Chris, this is what I want to do. I got half a dozen culverts I want to fix on the National Forest. What can you do for an implementation grant and how do we move forward? So hopefully when you're done with your wrap, you've got these sort of lists ready to go. And you can start moving forward and trying to get organized about how you're going to implement things. So I know we're a little short on time, so I'll cut it there. But the only thing I'll say last is there's two resources I'd like to offer you guys from our neck of the woods. Is our wrap is on our website right now or at upperyampawater.com. Here's the Bear River wrap. It's up there for anyone to look at or download. And then the other thing is we have a great organization locally called the Routt County Wildfire Mitigation Council, and they have recently come up with a recovery playbook, which I think can be adapted at any community in a post-wildfire manner if you're thinking about planning and how to recover. This was just recently developed by those folks and how to get going. So I'll end it there because I know we're running short and go over for some questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy. And I do want to acknowledge that it's basically the hour, but I will leave this Zoom open for another 5 or 10 minutes. I know folks have to leave, but at least it'll be recorded if we have questions. So I'll open it up for questions. Apologies, we went a little long. That was on me for timekeeping, but Any questions out there? Feel free to come off mute. Okay, David, generally, what type of culvert improvements are you suggesting? Upsizing based on typical debris or increased capacity to account for sediment flow?
I think it depends on the culvert, right? You have to go out there and analyze the culvert that's on the ground and see what its deficiencies are. I think a lot of them are going to be both, I would say, sediment flow and debris kind of fall together, but also the post-fire hydraulics. Any of you have started to look at that, what a post-fire 5-year return flood looks like compared to a pre-fire, those magnitudes look awfully scary. And so then you have to play the game of risk versus reward and cost, and how far can you go to upgrade a culvert. So those do take a lot of detail, and I think it's probably specific as to where you're going to find that balance.
Thanks, Andy. And I think some of our other speakers are here too, so if you have questions for them as well, we can ask those too.
Can I just ask a question verbally for Andy?
Yes.
I'm curious, I don't know where you've gotten to and with your discussions with the Forest Service. I saw that you convinced Chris Sturm with your project data sheets, but curious as to how well has these processes, and this could apply to the Big Thompson project as well. How well has this helped communicate with the Forest Service about projects that either they should allow or they should actually be considering themselves?
Well, I haven't quite started with the culverts yet because we're trying to get them to focus on our fuels mitigation, but especially with the fuels mitigation, our local Forest Service team said to us directly, you have a well-established, well-analyzed reason argument for why you want to do your fuels reduction and where you want to do it. And we were able to focus that as well. That's a whole nother presentation. So it did help for sure. And I think it will help when we go out and we have this full study behind it. We're not just picking culverts, because we want to. There's a reasoned argument for why we're doing it. So it does help.
Thanks. Joe Stanko just put in the chat, does anyone have suggestions on the people problem? Landowners that don't see themselves being part of the problem and don't wish to take fire mitigation actions. I feel like maybe Andy, you'd have some to speak to that, but maybe I'll ask Angie if first, since Angie had talked a lot about stakeholders. If you're still there, Angie.
Thanks. Will you repeat that question, Chelsea?
If anyone has suggestions on the people problem, having landowners that don't see themselves being part of the problem and do not wish to take fire mitigation actions.
We don't, I would say here in the Roaring Fork Valley where we've seen so much fire, we don't have a lot of people sticking their heads in the sand about the problem, but we do have plenty of people that are focused on pointing their fingers at others rather than tackling their own, junipers right next to their house or wood roof, things like that. We haven't yet at least taken the wrap down to the homeowner level quite yet. But I think all of these projects like the wrap and the landscape scale work that we're doing builds really important momentum. And the more people feel like they're on a bandwagon or on a train that's moving to a important destination that has momentum behind it, I think the better. That's a tricky one though.
Thanks, Angie. Yeah. Any other speakers want to chime in on that, Andy?
Yeah, I can take a crack. For us specifically, we are, we're mostly working with rural agricultural producers, and our way in there is, there's a pretty easy tie to risk to their livelihoods. Built flow lines, fancy word for ag ditches, head gates. We work with that community every day in delivering water. So we already have a relationship, and that tie-in is pretty natural where we say, look, we're not asking you all as private landowners to foot the bill and do this yourself. But if we identify that you might be at risk, will you let us help you? So that was the conversation that we've started to have with private landowners.
Thanks, Andy. Any other questions out there? Maybe just one more. Thanks for staying a little long.
think I saw Joel Schultes had a question about level of detail for updating models. Thought I would just touch on that for a minute.
Sure.
I guess kind of back to that, Joel, on what was going on with Big Thompson and then Alexander. Like I said, we only had, I think, one outlet point in that whole kind of Alexander Mountain area, which was already downstream of all the burn area. So I think whatever way you look at it is kind of, I think doing that VAR density analysis and understanding where you may have risk can really help you to understand where, say, we want a specific level of detail on that hydrologic modeling, where we want specific junctions or design points, where we need peak flows and hydrographs, then that basically feed back into that hydraulic model downstream. So just kind of really working with the consulting team to kind of take a look at where all those values at risk are and make sure that you've got enough detail upstream that you're going to be able to inform kind of the susceptibility analysis, which is the simple way of thinking about it. But happy to talk about that in more detail with folks that are curious.
Thanks so much, Jeff. Well, thank you all for being here. We will send out the resources and contact information, all the links that were thrown in the chat. I'll compile those, send those out with the recording. Thank you so much to all of our speakers. You're doing such cool work, and I'm so grateful for you for sharing it with us. And we'll catch you out there on this landscape to see what your watershed has and know before you go, as Andy kind of alluded to in his presentation. So thank you so much and have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, Chelsea.